Welcome to this rather odd session on information literacy. And I want to start by telling a story. So imagine that a pirate, a bard, a half orc, and two hobbits walk into the very proper study of a very proper historian in a town called Oregoth. And they proceed to have a conversation about the records of certain recent events in this town, possibly involving mythological creatures. And this our party of adventurers is not getting the information that they need, and so this retired pirate turns to this very proper historian and says, "Who's the worst gossip in Oregoth?" And the historian turns to the pirate and says, "What?" And the pirate says, "Who's the worst gossip in Oregoth?" And the historian says, "Why would you want to gossip? I'm the best historian in Oregoth." And we repeat this for some time. This was in a Dungeons and Dragons game. And this historian was being portrayed by our game leader, our dungeon master, who is a historian. And our pirate was being portrayed by a folklorist. And what was happening here, inside and outside the game, was a fundamental disagreement between a folklorist and a historian about what counts as information that could be useful. So the worst gossip in Oregoth, right, for a historian, not so great, not so reliable. For someone who wants to know what the fishwives are talking about down at the docks and what they might have seen flying over the ocean, this is a great source of information. And I want to give credit and blame where credit and blame are due. Mithrellis the pirate and Craig Pepin was involved in this. But this to us raised a different kind of question than we usually use to talk about information literacy. When we talk about information literacy, we're usually talking about how do we tell what kind of information is accurate or fits the context that we're in, or it's current, or it's reliable, or we can tell what the biases or lack of biases of the author is. Usually that's what we ask our students to look at for information literacy. But this was a slightly different question. And that is, what information is useful for what purpose, even if it's not very good information. I also want to give a hat tip here to a conference presentation that I was very pleased to hear about, 9 years ago now, by a folklorist, Meryl Kaplan. And this was at the American Folklore Society conference, and her talk was on stigmatized women's discourse in academia. And what it was about was conference gossip, which is another great example of this, because conference gossip, is it actionable? Is it something that, like, you could file a police report on? No. Is it something that older women scholars do to tell women graduate students which old men not to get in the elevator alone with? Yes. So we're talking about a type of information that we don't treat as necessarily reliable or provable, but is nonetheless extremely important situation. But this to us raised a different kind of question than we usually use to talk about information literacy. When we talk about information literacy, we're usually talking about how do we tell what kind of information is accurate or fits the context that we're in, or it's current, or it's reliable, or we can tell what the biases or lack of biases of the author is. Usually that's what we ask our students to look at for information literacy. But this was a slightly different question. And that is, what information is useful for what purpose, even if it's not very good information. I also want to give a hat tip here to a conference presentation that I was very pleased to hear about, 9 years ago now, by a folklorist, Meryl Kaplan. And this was at the American Folklore Society conference, and her talk was on stigmatized women's discourse in academia. And what it was about was conference gossip, which is another great example of this, because conference gossip, is it actionable? Is it something that, like, you could file a police report on? No. Is it something that older women scholars do to tell women graduate students which old men not to get in the elevator alone with? Yes. So we're talking about a type of information that we don't treat as necessarily reliable or provable, but is nonetheless extremely important situationally. But this to us raised a different kind of question than we usually use to talk about information literacy. When we talk about information literacy, we're usually talking about How do we tell what kind of information is accurate or fits the context that we're in, or it's current, or it's reliable, or we can tell what the biases or lack of biases of the author is. Usually that's what we ask our students to look at for information literacy. But this was a slightly different question. And that is, what information is useful for what purpose, even if it's not very good information? I also want to give a hat tip here to a conference presentation that I was very pleased to hear about, what is that, 9 years ago now, by a folklorist, Meryl Kaplan. And this was at the American Folklore Society conference, and her talk was on stigmatized women's discourse in academia. And what it was about was conference gossip, which is another great example of this, because conference gossip, is it actionable? Is it something that, like, you could file a police report on? No. Is it something that older women scholars do to tell women graduate students which old men not to get in the elevator alone with? Yes. So we're talking about a type of information that we don't treat as necessarily reliable or provable, but is nonetheless extremely important situationally. And this is the reason that I like the 6 W's exercise that the library provides in the resources for teaching information literacy. They provide they provide a lot of resources, but there are 2 main tests that you can give to your students very easily. And one is the CRAP test, which asks the students to evaluate the context, the currency, the reliability, the accuracy, and the purpose of information or sources that they're seeing. The 6 W's is a what, who, why, when, where, and how test that asks about what's in a piece of information or a source. Who did it come from? Why was it written? What's the agenda or the purpose? Is it current? Where did you find it? And how are you planning to use it? How did the creator use it? And it's that how question that comes up in this sort of exploration of what we do with information that we might consider questionable. And it's something you can use in class, but it's also something that you can use yourself as kind of a mental shorthand when you are on a social media website and you're like, where the hell did that come from? I'm not going to talk extensively about social media today, but you can, one way to kind of activate this in your head is join a new network, one of the smaller networks, and like kind of see how that network does and doesn't indicate misinformation, and how it's presented differently. And the newness of it can kind of prompt you to think about this. So with our key question in mind, which information is useful for which purpose, we can start to think about that information that we usually eliminate, right, or critique using a test like the CRAP test. And think about what we're going to do with it. I've got some questions I'd like us to think about, whether there's information that's never useful, what we do with information in different contexts that might or might not pass the CRAP test. And if we've got something that doesn't pass the CRAP test, but it still has a usefulness, how do we acknowledge that this information is kind of mixed usefulness? And then how do we coach students to do that? So I'd just like to throw these questions out to our group, starting with this first one. Is there information that is never, ever useful, or that might cause you to put scare quotes around even the word information? Any of this would alarm the chronicler of Orgoth.
Jane, I mean, look, this is such a tough question in the mega age of information. If you asked me 15 years ago, I would say no, right? Because every piece of information we can evaluate in some level. I'm still thinking a little bit academically, rather than, generically, but I would still try to say, I mean, I guess the very pedestrian or basic example is if someone's telling a non-truth, we're still gaining information. Where's the source? Why might they be saying a non-truth? So in a sense, any piece of information is useful.
You just, I think, pointed out something really interesting, which is if somebody's telling an untruth, that can still be information. But then you listed a whole bunch of ways that we contextualize that untruth, right? That we recognize that it's untrue. Whereas, a lie in isolation is a very different kind of thing. Like propaganda in a society that doesn't have free speech is a very different thing from, Breitbart making movies or other forms of like highly biased media that take place in a broader media landscape. So I think that's a really important point that you're gesturing toward, which is that the context matters and how much context we have matters.
Yeah, Marianne was spot on, and it makes me think that information doesn't have any meaning without context. It's sort of like it's just a datum. And it becomes information when you put it in context. So I work with data all the time, and when you say you have aggregated data, you get an average or you get a percentage. That's just a number. It doesn't really have any meaning in itself. And so, where did this data come from? Who collected it? Who responded? What when I get student information, then I see that sometimes it's self-contradictory.
Right.
I just have to kind of understand where that data comes from, what the respondent, what they're like. Yeah.
To maybe try to reframe what you're saying. So it's like no information or perspective is without some amount of bias. And so by recognizing who says that information or who's providing it, you can better understand what that information means because you can factor in the bias and the perspective.
That's pretty true. I mean, even when you think about, science is supposed to be like a self-correcting field, and you run an experiment and it gives you some results, and you go to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, and people review it and send it back and forth, and then they deem it worthy of publication. But there's already bias inherent in that whole process. So we say it's good information because it was vetted by experts, but you can always sort of, where does that expertise come from? What's the history of it? There's always, bias doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just I'm biased by the way I was trained as a scientist in this field, blah, blah, blah. So I see this work in such and such a way.
So you said two things that I think that I want to highlight. And one is about, what you were just saying about bias. But the other is like you work with a lot of data all the time, and you build the instruments to collect that institutional data, right? And as a chemist, you build the experiments. And so I think there's also a piece that like humanists like me don't always think about, which is the complexity of the methodology. Like me, folklorist, ethnographer, I want to go talk to the gossipy fishwife at the docks at Oregoth and like think about that story. You're thinking about like, how do I ask the survey questions that I'm asking?
But you have to think about that too when you to do an ethnographic interview. You have to frame it. You have to be culturally aware. You have to approach your research with knowledge and methodology. I don't think it's that different.
Yeah, I mean, the methodology is there, but I think compensating for methodology is something that I think we think about differently in different academic disciplines and in different professional situations.
I always thought with cultural anthropology, there is like that weird like relationship where like the whole single story concept where like what you say now becomes the one definition for this entire group is tricky because like on some level, you hope that the consumer of your data doesn't fall into that trap. But also like if I am trying to like putting myself in that role of telling a story from a cultural anthropological standpoint, I don't want to pick somebody that has like is an outlier necessarily. So like I do also have a little bit of
Right. And that question of representation and big picture versus small picture, if you look at the spectrum between like sociology and folklore and the kind of the way that funnel narrows toward folklore or widens toward sociology in terms of the scope of claims that people are making and the specificity of context that the research might report or might not report, it's really interesting. That's really easy to overlook when we're talking about information is what's the information you don't have. Like if you're looking at false information and you don't have the context, we mentioned that, but also like if you're looking at, a scope of perspectives on something and you discard some of them. And I think this is a really topical thing when we're talking about modern politics and echo chambers, right? The sources of information that somebody gets in like academic, spaces dominated by academics or writers on Blue Sky versus what you get on Truth Social or anywhere in between. It's not just that we don't agree, we're not seeing the same threads of information, good or bad, at all.
Even when we have the same information, we don't even put it in the same context, I think, in the same reality. So that's the thing that's really scary to me.
Right.
As you're doing a study, you don't want to find some information. Like with archaeology, I think a lot of it, like the ideals of archaeology works best in Europe because like there isn't necessarily a colonial aspect to it because it gets really messy from there. But like in terms of looking at like political data, like if I am doing research, I don't necessarily want to find information that deeply unsettles my political belief system. So it's really tricky because like my morals can't get pulled away if I'm doing that research, if that makes sense.
I'm also a scholar of religion. So there's this question of like, where does religion come from? Like, is it about the thing that we believe in, or is it about the thing that we do with the thing that we say we believe in, right? Yeah. Which is that's the camp that I fall into in the study of religion is I don't really care what your official creed is. What I care is what you go and do, and then how you rationalize what you're doing and what stories do you tell about what you're doing. Yeah. And that doesn't make any of this stuff factual. Like, it's not going to pass the crap test. But it is something that, because it's about how this community is expressing itself and how they bring themselves together using these types of information, like from this perspective, like that's very useful information, because that tells us things about what people believe, how they come together around it, what their values are, how they identify themselves in relation to other people. So that might be particularly relevant for like the idea of Brandon, right. Or like the idea of Pepe the Frog or something, that are really about like, how do we show our in-groupness and that everybody else is like something else and we don't care, or we don't like them or whatever the difference is. So yeah, I think that like that's a situation where the value of the information is not in its factuality. Right. It's in what it demonstrates.
Right.
Trillion-ton iceberg that's broken off and heading in Antarctica. Did everyone hear this? And it's been on the news. Okay, and it's heading toward Georgia and South Georgia Island and so I'm thinking like, and we're in this academic setting, so we engage in inquiry, analysis, all our competencies, right, with digital literacy. So we're thinking, okay, what is this? How do we evaluate it? But there's and this is really I think we talked about context, but we should also, and I think you and I think it's Jay was also, and we're talking about the recipient of the information. So, the parent that's trying to get the kid to daycare and wondering how much milk and orange juice went up in price overnight. And they hear, this trillion-ton iceberg. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. Well, to us, it's fascinating because I guess it initially broke off in 1986. But I've heard this during my drive, in and out today to campus. I've heard the story like 4 or 5 times. So is that information useful, or would it never be useful, or is it in this moment useful? I'm just throwing it out because it seemed like a very, it was an example from today.
I think that's a super interesting question. And like, I'm not going to pontificate on it, but it's reminding me of like in the lead up to the election last year where like people were like, why, like eggs are like $6 a dozen and, I have no money. And the certain politicians were like, well, the stock market's up. Right. And, for people at a certain income level, like who cares if the stock market is up? It doesn't have any effect. And it sure didn't have the effect that they sort of anticipate, that economic marker was anticipated to have on how people voted.
I feel like a lot of, the iceberg is interesting to people who have the time and energy to be interested in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, I lived in India for a little bit, and there was like, I had a lot of conversations with people about like the scope of care, if that makes sense. Like, there are so many stray dogs in India. That was a big surprise for me. And I was kind of like, why? And like the answer I got was like, this one woman said, the average Indian just doesn't have time or energy to care about dogs. Like, that really is just not a value. I don't know, but it's an interesting like vehicle for the concept.
That raises a whole different set of questions that I'm not prepared to talk about, but y'all can. About like the timeliness of information, like how we view information that is immediately relevant, and then how we view information that is going to be relevant in 20 years when the iceberg melts, but like seems really, peripheral when what you're worried about is whether you can find a dozen eggs that cost less than $9.
Right.
As you're saying, like there's privilege of having free time to think about that, and privilege of having the education to balance out what is important or like ultimately weighty information versus what looks like ultimately weighty information today. And that those are two very different experiences, right? So like we've been talking about, is there information that's never useful? My contention, right, is there's context in which some information isn't useful because we can't tell, this stuff, right? But in a lot of cases, quote unquote bad information, the stuff that the chronicler of Orgoth would not like, is useful. But how do we sort that out? Like, how do we like not necessarily our students, but how do we tell what's useful in different contexts or for different applications? And then how do we, like, if we've decided to use information that would be questionable in other contexts, how do we acknowledge what we're doing with that stuff when we make it useful?
I think, again, this kind of touches on the whole idea of bias, where like, if you are working with information, I mean, the dream, of course, with inquiry is that you approach it with literally no, you follow wherever it goes, but also like, how do you follow one thread versus another? And it's, you have your own personal agenda to a degree. So I was a seasonal outdoor education teacher, and each week we got a new group of like middle schoolers for a week. And there was like one situation in which I had a new group. I knew one of the kids was non-binary, and then another one of the kids made a "Let's go Brandon" joke, and I was like, "All right, we're not going to do pronouns." Like, I didn't say that, but I was like, normally I'm saying like, "Hi," state your name and pronouns if you wish. But like after that interaction, I was like, "No, that's not probably going to go well. So we're just going to do names and a fun fact, and we're just going to roll through this week." So I feel like it's like what your objective is does dictate how you like choose to interact with different information, even if it is somewhat questionable. Right.
Or what you are prepared to address, in a certain situation.
Because like with the week, I don't have time to talk about like to truly help this child understand the value of pronouns and that whole concept. Like,
I mean, I think that's a really important point. It's like, when I was writing these questions, I was thinking about like academic context. You're putting together information to teach with, right? Or you're deciding how you're going to talk about a topic like conspiracy theories, or ask your students to think about like political discourse or something where we really are talking about like information that you can look up. And then making decisions about, what does that information tell us? But, what you're bringing up is like discourses, right? Which are also information, but they operate a little bit differently. And how do we identify where those are coming from?
I feel like context is what makes information useful, if that makes sense. Like, let's say, do aliens exist? Like, from a hard science perspective, I don't think that's a super useful, like there's not a lot of great information to be had there. I mean, maybe it splits the room, but like from my perspective, but from like a sociology aspect, why do people think aliens exist? There's like a ton of information you can get with that question. And so like, it's in the wrong setting, it's pointless information, it's misinformation, but in the right setting, it's actually very informative. And I feel like most information, or most like don't know, for lack of a better word, like facts, like
Mm-hmm.
or theories. Again, in the right context, there's actually a lot to be had from any phrase. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. The tricky part then is like, and I agree with you, you know, as somebody who, you know, studies religion, studies folklore, um, like, yeah, I think we can always get something out of misinformation, even if it starts from the premise of, hey, this is wrong, but we want to understand why people talk about it so much. But I think there's also a point where, like, you do come, the Auroribus or whatever comes back around, and you do run into that question again of like, okay, what's happening? Like, I'm doing all this thinking about this thing that I know is wrong or that I think is not very relevant. But the question does kind of come up again. And we get in that position where like we've got that like redirect paragraph in our paper that's like, so yeah, remember this is wrong.
Right.
But you know, we always have to acknowledge that, which I think is really interesting, and particularly interesting when we have that sitting around and we don't acknowledge that, if it makes sense. We can do all kinds of stuff with, you know, what the crap test would tell us is bad information, and that is objectively inaccurate information. But we still are going to run into that inaccuracy piece somewhere. We, as people who have like various degrees and scholarly background and our own kind of disciplinary positions that we come at this question from, you know, we have this conversation in a different way than we would have it with students, or that students would have it with each other. And it's interesting. So I'll tell another little story. So the class that I teach here when I'm teaching is typically on religion and popular culture. The activity that I have them do is about religious perspectives on and religious activism about abortion. And so I split them into groups and I give them different sets of readings. And so we'll have one group that's reading like religious anti-abortion rationales, right? And we'll have one group that's reading religious pro-choice rationales. And so I was doing this one day, and I had a young woman student who, you know, was very political, and she happened to land in the group that was reading the anti-abortion religious rationales. And, you know, they were talking about this in the group, and I walked over to hear what they were saying, and she looked at me and she was like, "Do you actually think this?" And I was like, I've given you, you know, the class these perspectives as an exercise in identifying the logic and the information and the narratives that people draw on to you know, make these arguments or to undertake these political things. Like, I mean, I believe it.
Right.
Like, that means that this is an exercise that we're doing. But it was really difficult for students to kind of see that what we do with information, we don't necessarily do it because we agree with it. How do we get students to think in a nuanced way about information that we know is not factual and that we don't agree with? Working through the what do we do with this when we know it's wrong aspect of other kinds of information. You know, like if we have a student who wants to do a project on a conspiracy theory, you know, how do we help them understand, okay, which sources are part of this conspiracy theory, and which sources are about this conspiracy theory, and which sources are theory you can apply to this situation? How do we help them identify ways that it is useful and how to use it appropriately, acknowledging that it's not accurate?
I think it can't exist in a vacuum. I wrote some comparative papers on like different perspectives on like why one does archaeology in college, and there were some people I firmly disagreed with and found on a personal level like kind of offensive and racist. And you know, reading those papers, like the assignment was like I read those papers and then had to do kind of like a sum up write up. And then it was like a 3-paragraph or 3-section paper, summary of one article, summary of the other, and then like a comparison of the two. And I think like if you chop off that last bit, or if you chop out any of these, then it just doesn't have like teeth. And like you don't actually get to like you're too much in a vacuum to kind of get. It becomes just like a personal value paper. It doesn't become scientific in any sense.
Yeah. So you're talking about comparative method as a way of teaching writing, as a way of doing an exercise that doesn't necessarily require students to synthesize, but does require them to not just summarize.
Of those two articles, I thought that there were sections, like a small section of one that I thought was honest, and then a large section of it I thought was false. And on the other one, kind of like the flip, I thought most of it was honest, and then I thought they missed a few points. But if I just have one of those articles and I'm trying to discern it, I wouldn't really be able to I wouldn't have any navigation tools.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
You can get more out of taking two sources and identifying where they are right or wrong, particularly in relation to each other. And then synthesis would be kind of what you're describing as like, well, this piece of this is right, but most of it is wrong. And this larger piece of this is right. So what happens when we put the two things that we think are righter together and look at also at what the critiques are? That would be different from, say, having students summarize separately, what is this author saying and what is this author saying, without trying to make an argument about it or identify like what's useful or not useful in it.
Caroline got to the synthesis versus summary. And I think the synthesis is what's so fascinating, because that's where students, at least in the core, the synthesizing information is challenging. They want to just summarize, right? And we want them to take, quote unquote, a valid point of view. I tell any POV is fine. Just prove it, make sure you support it with credible, accurate information. There's no right or wrong. I say your point of view, you take your point of view, but support it. Ultimately what we're talking about, this question is critical analytical thinking, right? And what our job, or one of our jobs, is to let them know this is not just a classroom exercise, right? We're trying to create these skills to take into every single thing they're going to do in life, and not just gaming or, sound design, all these creative things that they're doing, but everything, right? In personally and professionally. I always encourage students to share even preliminary ideas, because we all learn, and I can walk them through reaching, an argument, and other students it can be beneficial. But a bunch of students were saying, well, I want to compare this and this, and I want to compare. And I said, boy, there are a lot of comparisons here. We're not going to compare. We're going to, create an argument which you're going to prove. And I said, why do you all want to compare? And the student said, oh, we don't have to make a decision.
Right. And that's where the comparative method can fall down.
It's so interesting to me. She said, oh, I don't have to decide. I can just tell you, here's this and here's that. I said, no, you've got to do your research, synthesize it, and establish an argument.
Right.
This is just an idea, but what if you took kind of like the model United Nations approach, but use that format just on like a subject. So you get, I don't know, class of, all right, let's say 20. Let's say you get 5 different papers, and everyone gets that paper, and then they need to not necessarily synthesize, but just summarize, because that this way they kind of get their teeth into the subject, and then the next assignment. Exactly. But once they've summarized their paper, now that whether they believe it or not, that's their argument. So now they get the other articles, and they need to prove why there is right. It's not necessarily getting on individual value, but it does get them to argue a perspective and actually do the argument aspect.
Right. The exercise of making an argument and rebutting an argument. I've done that too. I think it's really effective for student engagement, especially if you kind of heavily structure it. Having kind of the process of all right, I want your opening statements. Now everybody go away for 5 minutes and look at these sources. And now you need to rebut the opening statement you just heard. But the idea that you can make an argument, you can make a counter argument. And then the piece that I do with structured debate is I have 3 teams instead of 2. I have a pro and a con side, and then I have a judge side. And the judges at the end, they're not making a decision on whose side they think is right. They're making a decision on who they thought argued their side better. And they have to say why, right? They have to tell it. And the reason that
evaluation.
Right.
level.
Right. And the reason that I have done this is like in a writing class, it's a very like real time exercise in, okay, what is an argument? Like, what do we mean by argument? How do we handle the kind of they say, I say aspect of, dealing with sources, dealing with information.
And so I like came up to my teacher and I was like, but professor, I don't think anybody's ever right about anything or wrong about everything. It's just everyone has their own perspective. How do I do this? And so he gave me this type of argumentative paper where it's a 5-part paper. And the first part is you argue what you believe is the other person's point of view. Then the second paragraph is the circumstance in which that first paragraph is correct. Then the third section is your understanding of the situation. And then the fourth section is what would be needed in reality for you to be correct. And then the fifth section is what do you think is the best step forward for both sides.
That's interesting. What do we do with information? Like not just like how this vague question of how do we use it, but like, oh, we're going to write about it. We're going to talk about it in class. Like, how do we justify what we're doing with it? How do we contextualize it? How do we make an argument out of it? Like, I don't think we can teach people how to use questionable information without having them use questionable information, right? And in a way where we are saying, look, you got to tell us why you're using this, or you got to argue against this, or you got to, whatever your strategy is, but having folks actually address specific examples in substantive ways, I think it's really important.
Like the either or fallacy is my bread and butter. Like if I'm babysitting and I want the child to do a thing, I'm saying, okay, either we can do it this way or we can do it that way. It's your choice. And both of the things are what I want to happen. Yeah, that was my first introduction to that. And it was really exciting. I've taught like other just friends, like how to decode some things that like take a newspaper article.
Jump back a little bit to that class example I was referring to before, who says we don't have a debate about abortion in this country. We have logically reasoned positions that start from completely different fundamental beliefs. And that makes it really hard to have a conversation about it because, there's a fundamental belief at the root of it and you can't, like, that's very difficult to persuade people out of.
And I think that's where we are in our country today.
The deeply held belief.
The deeply held belief that we can't even talk to each other because we can't even imagine the value system we're talking to.
I think it was the first semester I was teaching at the college level, and I had them do like that classic comparative religion assignment, go to a service at a house of worship that is not in your tradition and write me a long, detailed observation about it. Like super, super common assignment. And this student, like the paper was like, tell me about the context, tell me about what you observed, tell me about, what people in that group say about it, and tell me, like, talk about how it's related to what we've been talking about in class. So this kid goes and he does all the descriptive stuff. And the second half of the paper was all about how Muslims were wrong because Jesus Christ said this and Jesus Christ said that. And I go to grade this and I'm like, my second year of grad school. And I'm like, okay, so this is fun. And, I emailed the student, was like, I need to talk with you. And, we had a conversation. And what I said, because I didn't want to get fired, was like, you can believe whatever you like. And I'm not going to tell you what to believe or what's wrong or what's right. However, the exercise in this class is to do this other thing. And for the purposes of this class, the Bible is not a factual source. Right. And so like that was the loophole that I was using was like, here, we are doing this thing. Here are the parameters for right now. And, maybe for students that gets internalized and transferred to other areas of learning, and maybe it doesn't, but you can get the exercise accomplished without getting fired.
Yeah.